Hi everyone, so I'm back with another poem, and this one is called A Legend of Northland by Phoebe Cary. Phoebe Cary was born in Ohio in 1824. She and her sister Alice, they co-published many poems together and then went on to writing individually. Now, from the title A Legend of Northland, the poet wants us to think about a legend which is popular in Northland, a folklore, a story which is popular in Northland. He wants us to think about the significance of these legends which are handed down from generation to generation. A Legend of Northland is a 16 stanza ballad, so let's look at the first three stanzas. Away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few, and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through, where they harness the swift reindeer to the sledges when it snows, and the children look like bear cubs in their funny furry clothes. They tell them a curious story. I don't believe 'tis true, and yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. In the first stanza, the poet tells us about the setting of the poem, that it is far away in the distant land of the northern hemisphere that this particular legend is believed. And he emphasizes on the distance by using philology in the first line by repeating the word away. And he says, the winters are very long and harsh there, and the days are very, very short. In fact, the nights are so long, the sun doesn't come up for a very long time, that people they find it difficult to sleep through those long nights. Second stanza, he charms his readers by painting this beautiful and vivid picture. And he says, when it snows, people use their reindeers to get around from one place to the other. And he says, the children, they look like cute little bear cubs because they are cladded in their funny and furry clothes to keep warm. Third stanza, the poet actually tells us a central theme of the poem, that he talks about this story or legend that is believed in this um, place, and he is not sure whether it's true, but well, let's talk about the poetic devices. Now, A Legend of Northland is a 16 stanza ballad. It has a very tight structure. It has four-line stanzas, and a ballad is a simple narrative poem of folk origin. These first three stanzas, we observe that the poet has used philology, as I mentioned before, which is repetition of the words away, away in Northland to emphasize on the distance of this land. He uses a simile to describe these cute little children who are clad in funny furry clothes and they look like bear cubs. Uses enjambment to emphasize on certain ideas portrayed in the stanzas. For example, he talks about these winter nights which are difficult to get through. He talks about the beautiful reindeers and how swift and fast they are. And he talks about this legend that it might not be true, but it definitely can leave a message. Definitely use alliteration, the repetition of the consonant sounds to add to the auditory imagery as well as capture your attention. And a couple of examples are funny furry clothes, that they cannot sleep through them, tell the tale, yet you. The next three stanzas. Once, when the good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching, just as he did, he came to the door of a cottage in travelling round the earth, where a little woman was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. And being faint with fasting, for the day was almost done, he asked her from her store of cakes to give him a single one. In this stanza, the poet introduces us to Saint Peter. Now, Saint Peter was one of Jesus's disciples who helped in spreading the gospel in the world. And here he was living in the world below and preaching about the Bible. Now, the poet refers to Northland as the upper region, and here we have Saint Peter walking in the rest of the world, therefore, the world below. Second stanza's narrative is fairly simple. He talks about Saint Peter traveling around the earth and spreading the good word of the gospel. And he says he came across a little cottage, and he probably could smell these beautiful cakes that were being baked in that cottage. We all know that the smell of a bakery is so luring and it's so delicious. Now, St. Peter was traveling and he was exhausted. The poet says he was faint with fasting, he was starving, he was famished. It was at the end of the day, and he was lured by the delicious smell of these cakes. So he goes ahead and asks this lady whether he can have one cake from her big store of cakes. Previous stanzas, the poet has used enjambment to emphasize on certain ideas. Now here he says Saint Peter, um, till he lived in the world below, to talk about how distant the northern hemisphere is. That it really feels like it is another world up somewhere, in the world, and the rest of us are disconnected from it, and we live in the world below. And probably also to emphasize on the saintliness of Saint Peter. Of course, the poet has adorned or decorated these stanzas with alliteration. Let's look at the next three stanzas. So she made a very little cake, but as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give away. Therefore she needed another and still a smaller one, but it looked when she turned it over as large as the first had done. Then she took a tiny scrap of dough and rolled it flat and baked it thin as a wafer, but she couldn't part with that. Now, in the first stanza, the poet tells us that she made a very little cake. Now, remember, the lady had a store of cakes. That means she had many cakes and she could have just picked one and given it to St. Peter. But no, she decided to bake, and the emphasis is on very little cake. But as it baking lay, now here the poet has used inversion. That means he has, changed the order of the words. The inversion of words is used to emphasize on the idea that when the cake was baking, the woman observes the cake, and that's when her greed surfaces. She made this very little cake, but to her, this cake seems too large to give away. Now, that is a perception of a very greedy person. Next stanza, the poet illustrates the effect of greed, how it changes your perception. How the woman baked another cake, and this one was smaller than the previous one. Once again, when she looked at the cake, it looked as large as the previous one. So, this lady, she took a tiny scrap of dough this time and she rolled it really thin as wafer. Can you imagine? The Saint Peter had asked for a cake, and this woman here is rolling the dough as thin as a wafer, and to her that too seemed big enough to give away. This stanza we see the extreme effect of greediness. In the previous verses, the poet has used many poetic devices. He starts with using inversion, which is, it is to change the normal order of words, and it's also called an astrophy. He's used repetition, rolled and rolled, just to emphasize on the woman's greed. Um, he's used enjambment to emphasize on certain ideas. Anaphora has been used where the word and has been used in successive and consecutive sentences, again to emphasize on how the woman was consumed by greediness and therefore she couldn't part away with even a tiny wafer. Of course, alliteration has been used, the repetition of consonants in order to, uh, you know, add to the auditory imagery and emphasize on the ideas. Now, here, still as a smaller, this particular alliteration is also called sibilance, which again emphasizes on how small that cake was and then reflects on the greed of the woman. We have a simile that the poet says, baked it as thin as wafer, once again to bring out the woman's greedy perception. Let's look at the next three stanzas. For she said, my cakes that seem too small when I eat of them myself are yet too large to give away. So she put them on the shelf. Then good Saint Peter grew angry, for he was hungry and faint, and surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. And he said, "You are far too selfish to dwell in a human form, to have both food and shelter and fire to keep you warm." In this first stanza, we see how this woman is apathetic towards the saint's condition of being tired and hungry. Surprisingly, the woman has no shame in admitting, and she says that the cakes that when she eats them, they seem too small, but when she has to give it away, they seem too much to give away, they seem too large to give away. And it is clear that she is blinded by her greed. The next stanza, Saint Peter grew angry. Anyone could be easily exasperated by and furious at this greedy and selfish attitude. And it is ironic that someone as saintly, people who are saints are cool, calm, and collected, that this woman's greed and selfishness was such and so extreme that it even provoked a saint's anger. And he's very straightforward. He clearly tells the woman that you are far too selfish. So here he says you are extremely selfish to dwell in human form, and because you have food and shelter and warmth, therefore you have no apathy for other people. Look at the poetic devices used in the previous stanza. So the poet has used repetition, he's used the word to urge his readers to think about this message and how greed can change one's perception. Something too small can seem too large just by consumed by greed. Of course, he is using enjambment again to not break the flow of the point that he's trying to make and create effect and impact on the reader. He's used alliteration, there's repetition of the sound of consonants, and examples are given in the slide. And of course, we see a little bit of dialogue in these stanzas, which makes it come alive, it makes the tale engaging for the readers. Look at the last four stanzas. Now you shall build as the birds do, and shall get your scanty food by boring and boring and boring all day in the hard dry wood. Then up she went through the chimney, never speaking a word, and out of the top flew a woodpecker, for she was changed to a bird. She had a scarlet cap on her head, and that was left the same, but all the rest of her clothes were burned, black as a coal in the flame. And every country schoolboy has seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. Because of his anger, in the first stanza here, St. Peter curses the woman to become a woodpecker. A woodpecker has to work very hard. He constantly pecks at the wood. He constantly bores his beak into the hard wood to create a nest for himself or find some food. And this woman had everything, and therefore she did not realize the hunger and exhaustion of other people. Here, St. Peter curses her to become a bird, that she will have to painstakingly build a shelter just as birds do. Just as birds fly miles and miles to look for food, and on some days they find scanty food. And similarly, this particular woman as a bird will have to work hard and labor just to find that scanty food, and she will have to constantly bore and bore. Now there is a pun on the word bore, of course. It's about the action of pecking into the wood, and it also talks about the boring life that this woman will have, the constant boredom of looking and working hard for food. And so we see the transformation of this woman into a bird. We see that she went up the chimney, and she didn't say a word, and suddenly out of the chimney was a woodpecker flew out, and the woman had been transformed into this bird. This woman flew out of the chimney. The poet says, that all her clothes were burned black as coal in the flame. And I think the clothes here are metaphorical of her black heart, which was consumed by this black greediness and black selfishness. So was all of that greed consumed her literally. It just ruined her life, by getting cursed by Saint Peter. Well, in the next stanza, the poet tells us that legend has it that every country schoolboy has seen this woman or this woman transformed into a bird, and people have seen this bird living in trees and boring for food. Leaves us with the message that greed and selfishness, they have consequences. Beautiful legend, and I'm sure Saint Peter didn't turn any woman into a bird, but this legend has such a beautiful message, and we're all consumed by greed and selfishness to some extent, and sometimes it makes us, apathetic towards other people. We the poetic devices in the previous stanzas. While the poet starts with an inversion, which is he reverses the order of the words, and he says, "Then up she went," only to emphasize on the fact that her actions had some consequences. He talks about the flame, which is symbolic of the flame of greed and how it consumed the lady. It uses the simile black as coal to bring out the darkness of greed. And of course, there's repetition of the word boring. He wants us to think about that entire action of boring, for it could be laborious and as well as tedious. Makes use of enjambment in lines 1 and 2 to you know convey his point effectively, and he uses alliteration. The consonants are repeated by when he says build is buzz, the trees still this, boring and boring, again to emphasize his points and to add to the auditory imagery. Well, I hope you enjoyed the analysis, and I think it's a simple but beautiful and effective poem. And I'll meet you next time with another poem. Until then, work hard and study hard. Bye.